Okay, well, thank you everyone so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. We're going to start off with comments from Emma Hunt from the Thomson Reuters Foundation, they were instrumental in helping put together the legal guide that CPJ just released today about journalist rights in Canada.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine, and good afternoon. My name is Emma Hunt, and it's an absolute pleasure to be joining you today from the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Many thanks to the Toronto Metropolitan University School of Journalism, to the Committee to Protect Journalists, and to the Canadian Association of Journalists for co-hosting this event. Thomson Reuters Foundation values very highly its partnership with the Committee to Protect Journalists, or CPJ, with whom we have collaborated extensively over the last few years. It's also wonderful to be joined by such distinguished speakers for today's panel, bringing considerable expertise as well as personal experience to this conversation about the legal challenges faced by journalists working in Canada. At the Thomson Reuters Foundation, we believe very strongly that the media is a crucial pillar of a free, fair, and informed society. An independent and thriving media holds government and businesses to account. It empowers citizens to make better decisions for themselves and for their communities. Societies in which journalists are able to report freely and professionally are safer and more inclusive. Institutions are more transparent and accountable, and power and resources are distributed more justly. Nevertheless, we see on a daily basis how media outlets are facing increased economic and technological challenges and have witnessed the alarming increase in attacks on journalists around the world. In a recent and very sobering report, CPJ notes that at least 67 journalists and media workers were killed in 2022, which is almost a 50% increase from 2021. I also note the increase in online harassment of journalists globally, with threats and intimidation, cyberstalking, doxing, and online impersonation and trolling having severe consequences on an individual's mental health, reputation, and ability to do their jobs safely. In this extremely challenging landscape, the Thomson Reuters Foundation strives to help create a positive environment for media to operate independently and safely. And this means ensuring that journalists know what their rights are and understand how to protect them. To this end, the Thomson Reuters Foundation and CPJ have worked over the years to produce a series of guides outlining journalist rights around the world. Focusing on the core needs of journalists in particular jurisdictions where we've produced these resources, the guides aim to be an on-the-go resource to help navigate the legal environment and stay safe while reporting. We produce these resources because safeguarding press freedom is critical globally, including in democracies such as Canada, where we've seen an increase in the scale of frequency of journalists being arrested, particularly when covering protests. Following the arrest of Amber Bracken and Michael Toledano when covering ongoing land defence demonstrations in Canada, CPJ approached TrustLaw, the Thomson Reuters Foundation Global Pro Bono Legal Service. CPJ cited extensive concern amongst its network about these arrests and proposed creating a Know Your Rights guide for journalists in Canada covering protests to help them to continue to do this work safely. TrustLaw then connected CPJ to law firm Blakes, Castles and Graydon to produce the fantastic resource that we are launching today. The guide covers topics such as the legal protections afforded to journalists during a protest, legal risks when covering a protest, the legal grounds to arrest a journalist reporting on protests, and practical tips to avoid charges, and recourse available to journalists once they are detained and/or charged. I just want to pause and say a huge thank you here to the lawyers who took this work on and did it pro bono, highlighting the power of pro bono legal support to meaningfully contribute to the protection of press freedom worldwide. We really do hope that this guide will help empower reporters to do their jobs, which are critical, safely. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoy this fantastic panel.
Great. Thank you so much, Emma. I really appreciate that. I just kind of wanted to go around and introduce everyone before we get started with questions. I'm Catherine Jacobson, the US and Canada Program Coordinator at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Next to me is Brett Jolly, the President of the Canadian Association of Journalists, Then we have Cole Burston, a freelance photojournalist. Next to him, we have Chris Luna, also a freelance photojournalist. They're both with the United Photographers of Canada, an organization that's working to make safety conditions better for photojournalists. Then we have Steph Wexler from the Canada Press Freedom Project, a group that is tracking the attacks on the press in Canada. Joining us virtually, we have Brandy Moran, who is based in Alberta, a freelance journalist who has extensively covered Indigenous issues in Canada. Then we have Justin Brake, who is also joining us virtually, a Newfoundland and Labrador-based journalist who is the host of the upcoming podcast, Bury Grounds. I wanted to start off with Justin. He faced civil and criminal charges for reporting on the 2016 Indigenous-led occupation of Muskrat Falls in Labrador. And in 2019, he won a landmark ruling from Newfoundland and Labrador's Court of Appeals that recognized journalists' rights to cover Indigenous land protests, even in cases where courts have granted injunctions. Justin, to start off, can you kind of tell us what that experience was like, facing these charges and the process of finally getting them dropped?
Sure, and thanks for having me. Well, I was covering the protests in Labrador against the Muskrat Falls Hydro Dam, and at one point in time, the protest turned into an occupation of the hydro dam site, the construction site, and that lasted for 4 days. However, on day 3, the Supreme Court of Newfoundland issued a court order basically ordering the arrest of individuals found to be in contempt of an injunction that had previously been granted to the Crown Corporation building the dam a few days earlier. And I was named specifically on that court order along with a bunch of the land defenders. And so as an independent journalist, I had very few resources. I didn't have a lawyer to consult with at that time. But I was fortunate enough that one of the members of our board of directors of the Independent at the time knew a lawyer, reached out to them, and that lawyer got on the phone with me right away while I was still in covering the occupation, and it kind of explained to me what could happen if I chose to stay and what might happen if I leave. And what it came down to is having to unfortunately make a decision to either continue reporting on this huge event that brought a multi-billion-dollar project to a halt and forced the political leaders in this province to meet with Indigenous leaders over concerns that had not been addressed. And so as the only journalist there covering it, live streaming regularly from inside the occupied camp, dozens of land defenders, most of them Indigenous, felt that when I made the decision to leave, because if you're arrested, what good is a cell phone camera or a computer to write stories if you're in a jail cell? So I had to make the decision to leave, and people were really afraid that they were about to be subjected to police brutality. We know how police often respond to land defense actions by Indigenous peoples, and so that was a really tough decision, and I was appalled, but was very unfamiliar with the legal terrain in Canada when it came to what my actual rights were. It felt wrong to me, but I felt like I had no choice but to comply with the order. And then that launched a multi-year court battle where even though I complied with the order, I still faced 2 criminal charges, which were eventually dropped 4 years later. But it was the civil matter that we won in court, and that more clearly defined what journalists' rights would be in such situations. So it took quite a toll on me personally to have to go through it. But in the end, it seemed like it was worth it because we got that ruling.
Thanks so much, Justin. That's sounds like quite an arduous process. Really appreciate you sharing that story. Brandy, I wanted to turn to you. You've been you covered protests or land defense action at Wet'suwet'en and at Fairy Creek, and at Fairy Creek as well. And I kind of wanted to know if the legal wins in Justin's case kind of actually translated to greater access at those sites?
Tanse, hello. You know, when I was covering the Fairy Creek protests, the CHA, as well as a number of media outlets, were actually taking the RCMP to court. And I took a physical copy of those proceedings with me to Fairy Creek at the time. Actually, I think I even took a copy of the Justin Brake judgment. I had them there for backup. I didn't have to use them. I felt empowered by them. But I mean, I still had to incorporate, I guess, my own journalistic instincts in those situations. So there was an experience that I had in Fairy Creek where I was interacting with some of the RCMP, and every interaction that I have, I record it either on video. If I'm unable to, then, via, sound recording. And so a couple of weeks after I'd returned from one of my assignments on Fairy Creek, I got a notice that I was being served, that I had to fill out an affidavit because one of the RCMP officers had testified that I lied to them while I was on the ground. And I went back and went through all of my footage, and I had that interaction with that RCMP officer. And so I gave that as evidence that that was false, and it was submitted there, in the court case with, that the media had against the RCMP. So, I utilized, things like that, and it was just a lesson for myself to always record those interactions, because police are known to blatantly lie or conveniently forget the facts of the interactions that you've had with them.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that as well. It sounds incredibly frustrating, disheartening. I also wanted to kind of turn to the two photojournalists that we have on the panel here, since they are out doing daily coverage and frequently kind of bear the brunt of, on a regular basis, of unpleasant, perhaps, police interactions as they're trying to go out and do their jobs and document what's happening. Chris and Cole, can you guys kind of describe what your day-to-day interactions with police are like, and how you kind of prepare yourself when you're going out, like how you're thinking about what you can and can't do when doing your job?
Sure. Hi, thank you for the question. As photojournalists, we have no choice but to be on the ground, and sooner or later throughout the day-to-day work, we, or you, if you're a camera person, are bound to have an engagement with a police officer that is trying to prevent you from doing that work, or a law enforcement officer that's trying to prevent you from doing that work. One of the strategies that we have in those instances, or approach that we have in those instances, is to be as aware of your legal standing as possible. Sometimes literally that means where you're standing. Two, to record the interactions, as Brandy had mentioned, extremely useful. And three, whether to assess whether it is something that you would be willing to be detained for, because often that doesn't get sorted out until after the fact. As a freelancer, there's an additional complexity because your employer may or may not be, one, aware, or two, willing to support you in that legal challenge. So often what we will do is call our editors and assess whether they want us to pursue it or not, stand our ground or not. As photojournalists, we are reporters on the ground, and we're literally recording evidence that has a direct political social purpose. We're informing the public of something. And often it's the case that we're the only ones there and representative of that civil function, but also of our publications. So it's really important that during those engagements, we act professionally, but also we understand that one of the consequences of doing our job might be illegal detainment, even if it's temporary.
Yeah, if I could just echo that a bit, it just seems it's getting harder and harder to do the job. Like, even just going out, I work for Bloomberg a lot, and it's a lot of business logos, and I know at some point throughout the day, I'm gonna encounter security or police that don't like me taking pictures of the outside of a building or something. And it's on me to just kind of figure out how much, what's worth it, because I know my rights, but oftentimes they'll try and trip you up and make up laws and call backup or something, and it's just getting harder and harder. I was standing on a frozen lake not long ago taking pictures of frozen houses, and police officers, forcefully taking me off the ice, and he's like, "This is private," and I know that you can't really own the lake in Canada. And he's putting it in my mind, he's like, no, they do own it, they own it, this is private land. Like, as soon as we get to the shore, he's flashing his handcuffs, and I'm just like, how far do I want to take this? Do I want to make this a big hassle for myself? And maybe I have a support system behind me, maybe I don't. As a freelancer, it's hard, like Chris said, it's hard to know who's going to have your back. And did I want to spend a night in jail or go to the police station? No. So take my pictures and leave, and I'll log the complaint, and that's kind of that. But it's harder and harder every day, it seems like. And public perception, I think, plays a little bit in that. Like, we have the right to photograph in airports, and a friend of mine was telling me he was photographing in an airport, and this lady's just giving him a hard time. Not showing faces or anything. He's making art, and she's like, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "Well, do you read the newspaper?" She's like, "Yeah, of course." And he's like, "Well, it's people like me that take pictures to get them into newspapers like that." And it just like a light went off in her head. She's like, "Oh my God, yeah, it's a person. It's not like a robot walking around like taking pictures or grabbing pictures off the net. It's like a person out there doing the job." So yeah, a lot of that.
Yeah, I'm really interested, Brent, in the advocacy work that CAJ has done to kind of address some of these issues. And I mean, you guys have really been at the forefront of making sure that the government is aware of all of these problems. But
yeah, I think it's a matter sometimes of repeating the same message ad nauseum. Some days I feel like a bit of a broken record, going on and on and on about the right of journalists to report in public spaces, the freedom of the press. These are all very well-established concepts in documents, constitutions, legislation. Yet, however, this kind of continually falls on deaf ears, and to the advantage of others. Detaining a journalist, as kind of Chris and Cole have said, is kind of a perfect crime. It stops the immediacy of the action. The person, you won't be charged with a crime for photographing in an airport or on a lake or somewhere, but nevertheless, it sort of stops the action in its tracks right there, and ultimately accomplishes the goal that law enforcement is trying to have or seeking out. To that effect, so I think that there's a major problem with education, to sort of sum up my general thought on that in terms of making it something progressive instead of just a gripe. And I think some of the pieces that we've got through the guide that CPJ and Thomson Reuters Foundation are putting forward through the Canada Press Freedom Project, I think these are all invaluable tools to help not only support what the journalist's rights are, but also to communicate to those in positions of power that what they're doing isn't acceptable, and that journalists have these rights, and these are not subject to negotiation. They are enshrined in, our Constitution, and are, shouldn't be challenged in this kind of way. I think to the point of talking about, we're talking, Justin and Brandy were talking a bit about the issues with, law enforcement, particularly in remote areas and rural areas, where we're talking about, resource extraction, land defense, and so on. I think that there's a key piece here that's missing in terms of how the RCMP or national other police forces go about, enforcing injunctions. And I think part of that is understanding that there are these documents in place, and that, that you could make a one-page summary and put it in the briefing book that the RCMP or others send out to, the boots on the ground who are actually enforcing the injunction. And that would solve this problem in one fell swoop. So, continue as we will. And I think hopefully that's something that will eventually become de rigueur in the enforcement of actions.
Yeah, thank you. Great points. And Steph, I just kind of wanted to turn to you and zoom out to get the bigger picture of trends that you've been noting at the Canada Press Freedom Project, a wonderful tracking mechanism of all of the press freedom violations in the country, and where you see things kind of going.
Sure. Well, something I can explain a bit is the types of data that we do track, and therefore what we're kind of seeing the types of issues that panelists are discussing today. Can you hear me better? Thanks. So we track press freedom violations across 12 categories. Those include some of the types of incidents that we've talked about today, which might range from denials of access to arrests and physical attacks, harassment and intimidation, and more. And some of the data that we collect through that process per incident has to do with the types of media workers affected. So just some of the points we've discussed: are you a photojournalist? Are you primarily working in written media? Do you work for a mainstream broadcaster? Do you work for an independent publication? And under what types of circumstances did the press freedom violation occur? So that enables us over time to be able to see what types of media workers are being affected at, for example, sites of land defense. So we do increasingly have verification that, in fact, for example, independent workers might be disproportionately targeted at events such as the protests at Fairy Creek. We might also have an increased sense that those are commonly people working in visual mediums. And similarly with events like the convoy protests happening across Canada, we do have the sense that, for example, people who work in photojournalism or broadcast media are disproportionately targeted because they are more identifiable as media to the people who might be targeting them with those press freedom violations.
Thanks so much. I just kind of wanted to open the floor up to the journalists here and ask what they have, if they've noticed any sort of substantial changes over the past, I want to say 5 to 10 years. You guys have all had decently long careers, as far as approach from law enforcement, or perhaps changes in newsrooms about how these kind of issues are discussed, safety protocols, I mean.
I will say over my many years working, 13 years, only once have I had an editor give me a phone number for somebody to call just in case I got arrested at a protest or something. And I get sent to stuff all the time. And this was a US publication. And I was like, holy shit. They care a little bit. It's incredible. But it's rare. It's really rare that you feel that kind of support. So I think this guide is a good start. But like I said, you can know your rights as much as you want, and they can just make up their own rules and make things harder for you. So it's how far you want to take it and how right do you want to be.
Yeah, I can say too that, in my 12 years as a journalist, and over the last several years, reporting on the front lines of, land defense, that things have gotten worse. I mean, it was just, a year and a bit ago that Amber and Michael were arrested. And I have gone out to Wet'suwet'en territory several times since then, and the police still, track and harass us when we're out there as journalists. There are a number of personal safety measures that we need to put in place. So I don't really see that improving. As far as the support from the different editors that I'm working with as well, as a freelancer, I think because I specifically work, in telling Indigenous stories, which involve a lot of these type of events, that it's just a normal thing for them to provide me with those resources, with numbers, for lawyers to have, to be equipped with your letter of assignment and to have, all your ducks in a row, so to say, when we go. And I feel completely supported by them, even though, they don't really have any ties to me as a freelancer. So.
If I can add to that. A few measures that I've seen being taken by different publications on assignments that I've been on have ranged from extensive meetings with in-house lawyers regarding planning surrounding legal issues. So trespassing is a good example. Figuring out what exactly constitutes trespassing and what doesn't, so that if a detainment or an interaction occurs, where you stand, and then after the fact that you have a defense. Another measure is for freelancers, a big achievement is getting press passes from the publications that you frequently work for. And although as far as I know, there's no authoritative body that issues press passes, it often has the social effect of influencing law enforcement and convincing them that you're a press corps member, that you're working for the press. What else? Yeah, and I think that's, and then also, on a case-by-case basis, working with your editors and understanding how far they're willing to take it. Because yes, you can get legal offices involved, but it may mean you spend a night in jail, and whether you or your editors want that is an entirely other question. Yeah, I think that's it.
Brett, you want to touch on?
Yeah, I think the point that Chris is saying about media pluralism is kind of really interesting to sort of dig into a little bit, because we're not in a we aren't a concentrated environment. We're not in we're a very plural ecosystem right now, especially with the growth of digital media and sort of moving away from the traditional television, newspaper kind of model. And I think that's an interesting little phenomenon that's only going to increase some of the challenges that journalists face, because when it's on the front lines and, there's someone from law enforcement, looking and you're representing a digital independent, recently launched within the last 5 years kind of organization, they're going to say, oh, I never heard of that. And then they think that you're sort of you're an activist, which is sort of the word that, every journalist, a shiver sort of runs down your spine when you start thinking of that. And, Justin probably can talk about this, but there are, for example, tests in the court decision, Justice Green's court decision around, being an activist versus being a journalist. But I think that that's something, because if we look at the ruling from the BC Supreme Court in the Fairy Creek case, there was a lot of independent, fairly new upstart organizations that provided affidavits and things like that, testimony to what had transpired. And that was all well and good. But then I think it was interesting to see how Justice Thompson kind of reacted when we had Paul Johnson from Global News come in, because all of a sudden, bam, oh, Global, we know Global because Global's a, longstanding, news organization that everybody's familiar with. And that sort of removed a bit of the, defrosted some of the, the cloudiness there. So that's just an interesting little nugget of pluralism and why, this is always very contentious.
Yeah. Justin, I would be curious, could you kind of parse through a little bit more about what Brent was saying about the distinction between being an activist and a journalist, and how that was kind of weaponized in a way in your case?
Yeah, well, there was quite a bit of discussion going on during, while I was doing the coverage. And then, of course, when I became the news and this court order named me, then there was a lot of debate led by journalists in the province, a lot of mainstream journalists who worked for outlets that did not send their reporters or did not let their reporters go and cover the occupation. Because when that happened, there was a moment, there were a few minutes where journalists, reporters on the ground there had to make a decision. And it seems to me that the networks that were there, aside from me representing the Independent, told the reporters to stay back and not to follow the story. So I became quickly then sort of the center of controversy, and whether or not I should have actually made that decision to follow land defenders. And so that was sort of addressed in the court decision, and they, the judge basically wrote that, when courts are considering whether the presence of a journalist in a reporting from a place where there is an injunction, whether it's a material fact, he laid out a series of non-exhaustive, he said, considerations that could inform parties. So this is not complete or necessarily thorough, but they basically say that the person, should be engaged in apparent good faith news gathering of a journalistic nature, that they're not assisting, participating with, or advocating for the protesters about whom they're reporting on, that they don't aid or abet the protesters in their actions or in breaching an order that's already been made, that they don't obstruct or interfere with law enforcement, and that the matters that they're reporting on can broadly be said to be ones of public interest. So that seems to me like that is sort of the beginning of an outline or a list of things that would separate journalists from other people who may be recording events in a similar situation.
Yeah, Steph, I'm interested if you guys have a litmus test as far as like trying to figure out in your cases, like deciding what fits into attacks on journalists and what is more of kind of actions against activists.
Yeah, so we actually, we use a very similar threshold to establish who can be subjected to a press freedom violation. So I believe the language is, off the top of my head, something like someone who is or is being targeted for having in the past committed an act of journalism in good faith. So we also require that test to some extent for people who are counted in our database. But of course, we also have thresholds across different categories, which might be a separate question. But the good faith aspect has sort of become increasingly important because of the impact on press freedom conditions across the gamut in instances like land defense, for some of the precedent-based reasons that both Brandy and Justin have talked about so far. And I'll also just add to that sort of in broad support of increased resources. We share CPJ and Press Law's goal of increased rights-based education, because I think what a lot of these things have in common, especially for what we call sort of like high volume incident areas, which are in the last, I'd say, year or two, both land rights protests and convoy related incidents, are, the goal of press freedom violations of certain types is truth show. So in many cases, when people don't go in with an understanding of the rights, which is understandable for all sorts of systemic reasons, The effect of that is people are dissuaded from pursuing that coverage or discouraged from doing it in the future.
Good point. Good point. Thanks. Yeah, I was also kind of wondering for the journalist or anyone else who would care to address this. Like, I know in the United States we've seen increasingly hostile views of the media across the board, right? And just a mistrust in institutions that I think only worsened during the pandemic. I was wondering if you guys would be able to kind of suss out whether or not that's happening in Canada to any extent, and if so, what some of the inflection points have been. Certainly, the pandemic was one of them, but yeah. Any takers?
It definitely feels like it's on the rise. You know, we're usually a few years behind America in terms of certain things, and it feels like it's kind of spilled across the border. I remember covering one of Trudeau's campaign events, and it was kind of the first time I'd seen just tons of anger and you know, people yelling, throwing stuff, and just like, it was just the first time I'd seen that, and a few of us looked around and we looked at each other and we was like, this is kind of the start of something, it felt like. And it just kind of got worse over the course of the campaign, and yeah, I think it's just people who had stuff taken from them, and you know, if you look at the media every day during the pandemic, you look at the newspaper, it's COVID and it's bad news, and these people were looking for something to blame, and it was politicians and it was media, and yeah, it just felt dangerous. It just didn't seem like people didn't like us. It still feels that way, and it still feels like it's building that way. I feel like we owe it to people to do a good job and to be honest with people and to kind of win a bit of that support back. You know, I want people to like us. If I do a great story, I want people to read it. Otherwise, what's the point of doing it at all, honestly?
If I can add a little bit to that, it definitely feels like the vitriol targeted at media and photojournalists specifically, because as Stephanie said, we're very visible. We have our cameras and we're often just there, is on the rise and often linked to, say, like social movements or like the Convoy. There's a clear connection between anti-media sentiments and whatever else they were advocating for. The great irony, I think, is that we are increasingly in a surveillance society, both corporate and state. Yet the actors behind that surveillance are kind of anonymous. We don't know. Whereas photojournalists, our names are on the byline. We're easily, findable, searchable on Google, and that we're accountable to our editors and our public editors and the public. So there is a relationship there. You can find us and talk to us and ask us questions. And that's a deep irony that I think exists in our time, that so surveilled, yet, the relationship between media workers and public is really, it seems really weak at this point.
Yeah, and I also think it's interesting. It's kind of, I feel like photojournalists frequently, because they are on the front lines, literally, when conditions worsen for them, it's kind of a harbinger of what is to come. And the same with reporting on Indigenous communities, because they are frequently geographically not as accessible. When bad things happen to journalists covering those communities, it very much signals a deterioration in press freedom, and not to be fatalistic, but a bad trend. Brent, you?
Yeah, I mean, to answer your question about, I would say hell yes is probably the answer I would give. That, if we can only rewind the tape here a little bit to about a year ago when, the so-called Freedom Convoy started rolling its way up the 401 and the 416 to Ottawa and all points in between. And, we're in Toronto where we are today, there was, CTV and CBC and Global had to take the the decals off their vans, and they're getting their windows bashed in, and journalists are being spat at, and God knows what else. I mean, what is the root of this? I mean, you could come up with a laundry list of about 100 things, I would think, but the sort of Trumpist, if you want to call it, authoritarianism, creeping authoritarianism, however you want to refer to it, I think is definitely a factor that we're seeing here, sort of bleed over the border, and I think that this is something that's also extended as well to digital spaces, and it's not just in real life as well that we're seeing continually people, particularly journalists of color and female journalists, being assaulted online, having horrific memes, attached to them, being doxxed by all kinds of nefarious players. I think where we are right now is a time where we're really going to have to tie up our boots and figure out how we're going to fix this, because if we keep poisoning the water the way we are, we're not going to have a democracy much longer.
Yeah. I mean, it strikes me as interesting that it's almost kind of like a Goldilocks problem, right? The relationship that journalists have with the people they're reporting on is either too close and they allegedly bleed over into the activist territory, right? Or they can be accused of just having it out for the people that they're covering. There never seems to be the proper scenario of no one's ever quite satisfied, which perhaps just speaks to some good reporting. No one's happy with the story. Chris, I see, or did you have something?
Yeah, if I could just add one last thing. It seems to me that the folks that are most critical of media workers are also have the least amount of media literacy. And it's often the case that, I have a conversation with somebody who seems to hate media, and they aren't aware of who the Canadian Press is or who the Associated Press is. And to me, that says there's been a decline in media education. People don't know how we're working, what we're working for, what we're doing on the sort of like the bigger scale. On the micro scale, as a photographer, you can't know what we're taking photograph of. You can't know what's in the frame. You can't even know if we're taking a photograph, even though the camera may be, and this is true for police, law enforcement, as well as the public. So it is like there has to be a conversation. There has to be better education in terms of media literacy. It seems to me.
Yeah, great point. Good point. Mindful of the time, I just kind of wanted to see if any of the panelists had any additional comments they wanted to make before opening up the floor for questions. No.
I will add one thing if it's okay.
Please.
This is just relevant to what we were talking about a few minutes ago about about whether the court decision in my case was having an impact. And I had to search for this, but the Narwhal actually did an investigation. They published an investigative piece last May that revealed that the RCMP when Amber Bracken and Michael Toledano were arrested, November 19th, 2021, the next day, the lead RCMP officer on that file to deal with the land defenders in BC and Wet'suwet'en territory emailed the top brass of the RCMP saying that his unit on the ground, they were following the standards to identify journalists as described in my case. That's the sort of criteria that I read off to you there a little while ago. However, Amber, who was recording her arrest and as she was being arrested, she mentioned to the RCMP officers who were arresting her that she had legal rights, and she cited my case. And they said, and I quote, this is from the Narwhal piece, if you're accredited media, we'll deal with that, but everybody's been arrested here for breach of the injunction. You had the option to leave and should have left. If you're any credible media person, they would have left. I've dealt with hundreds, thousands of media people in my service, okay? And they said explicitly that they were not aware of that court ruling. So all of that is to say that even though we've made this legal progress in Canada, we can't count on the RCMP to know the law themselves. They don't appear to actually be informed when they're carrying out these hugely controversial operations and arresting journalists, that the law has actually evolved and they can't just handcuff photojournalists and reporters on the ground. So we actually have evidence, thanks to the Narwhal, who got this through access to information legislation, that during the arrest of Michael and Amber, the RCMP officers conducting those arrests actually had no idea of the court decision from Newfoundland and Labrador. So I just wanted to add that. Don't depend on the police to actually know the latest updates on the law.
Yeah, that's incredibly concerning, and also kind of reminds me of Brandy's anecdote about printing out the latest decision in a letter from CAJ to take with her while covering protests.
Well, and the same thing happened in Fairy Creek. I mean, the day after Justice Thompson's decision came down, there was a rounding up of some local journalists who were also in the area, and they said, "Haven't you read the court decision?" And they're like, the officers there were completely dumbfounded. So I wonder what the answer to that is, because I remember in the case of what was going on with Amber and Wet'suwet'en was also telling the RCMP, and this is, I think, something that's, that Amber would speak about if she was even here today, is that the Narwhal was notified the RCMP that Amber was in the area and that she was working as a journalist. So, put a yellow sticky on that to say, make sure, do not arrest this person. And yet they still kind of managed to, defend or perform the indefensible.
Brandy, did you have anything that you wanted to add about that? I know that, okay. Well, thanks so much. I kind of wanted to open the floor up for questions now, if anyone had any, please. Sure, that'd be great.
Hi, I'm Ian Wilms. I've been a photojournalist for 16 years, and some of you know me. Hi. In that time, I've had memory cards wiped by police, cameras destroyed, drinks thrown at me. I've been illegally searched and threatened by cops more times than I can count. I've been assaulted by police. I've been arrested and abducted while working on assignment. And every time I try to pursue any kind of complaint, it's a thin blue line style response with a bunch of people pointing fingers at other people, and nothing ends up getting done. I went to the OPIRD after the G20 summits. Nothing happened. I would like to thank CAJ for kind of having my back last summer or the summer before. It seems to me, through working with United Photojournalists of Canada, or UPOC, that there needs to be a recognition by law enforcement of organizations of professional journalists in this country. I'm not really sure what the process is for that, but CAJ gives out a press card, for example, that needs to hold some kind of legal weight in the eyes of the RCMP, the OPP, and so on. So I guess my first question is, are you approaching that at all as an organization? And then if I could piggyback a second question on there, it would be nice to see more representation of photojournalists within your organizations, and I'm wondering if you're taking any steps towards that also. Thank you.
About the cards, yeah, absolutely. It's good to see you, Ian, by the way. Thank you for coming. Look, I think what we can do is, to speak to, well, actually both of your questions. I think maybe there's a card that we can all design. I don't know, that works, for, journalists, reporters, editors who are out in the field, and also visual journalists. I think that's something that would be pretty spiffy and might solve a lot of these issues. I hope. This isn't wood, I don't think, but I think that about the press card, this is stuff we've talked to the RCMP about after Amber and Michael were arrested, and we specifically said, we will put together a summary one-pager for you to put in this binder, and that was sort of nodded at and agreed to. But then there's always sort of a reason why, it's explained away, being like, oh, I'm sure we'll figure out a way to do this. So I'm saying, look, we can do that. I can put together a digest of Amber's case, Justin's case, Fairy Creek, any other, and ones in Colloquiate Sound, all kinds in the middle. I'd like to do that right away and solve this problem once and for all, because clearly there's a disconnect. So I'm happy to do that. So let's do it.
Any other questions? Oh, please.
Hello, I'm a journalist here at TMU, Charlene Hatcher. Cole, my question's for you today. At one point you said, what's the point in doing your job, or doing it all was your exact words, if nobody's going to read your story or watch it. So I just want to ask you, have you ever felt fear or a lack of motivation to pursue a story given the current landscape of violence and media distrust? And if so, how have you faced that, and how have you overcome that feeling?
Great question. Thank you. I remember specifically during the pandemic, I was looking at Getty, I was looking at stuff around the world, and everything was being documented, and this was like unprecedented for a lot of people. And I think it's worth documenting and showing the world what's happening in Toronto and Vancouver and every country and every city in between. And I remember photographing a line of cars waiting for testing, and a police officer just gave me a pretty hard time. And I followed his orders. I'm standing where I should, and it just kept escalating with him. You can't stand there. No, you can't stand there. And he's calling for backup, and a cruiser's coming in, and I'm standing there. I'm like, this is all for a line of cars waiting to get tested. And my editor's off for the weekend. Like, what's this all for? Like, am I in the wrong? He's making it seem like I shouldn't even be there. So I kind of made a decision in my head. I've got what I can get, and I'll leave and follow up with the supervisor, and I did. And his supervisor was like, yeah, he can't tell you to not do your job, but he doesn't want you to do your job, is what he said. Yeah, I don't know. I just kind of pushed through it, I guess. And I looked at the photos later, and they fit there on Getty with everything else in the world. And yeah, just I guess it's motivation to just keep doing it. But there's often that pushback, so it is hard to keep doing it, I think.
I just wanted to share that, I experienced that anxiety and intimidation when I'm out there on a regular basis, and I have to just be diligent of putting safety protocols into place, like for my own safety, not only because I'm an Indigenous person, and our people experience brutality from policing very highly in this country or across North America, but also because of the way that journalists are treated by them. So I have to put those precautions in place, letting my editor know where I am. Sometimes I go to places where there's no self-service, it's very remote. I have to go to point A to point B, and during those times when I'm alone and I know that police are in the area, thinking that they're going to come out and follow me and stop me in the middle of nowhere, it's really scary. And so I set up these time frames to make sure that we have contact. In fact, when I was reading the guide before today, when I received it, it says that journalists, or their editors should let the police know beforehand that their journalists are going to be in the area. For me, in my own experience, when I'm reporting on something like with Suatin, I don't have my editors or myself let the police know that I'm there until I'm actually at the location where I'm going. I don't let them know beforehand, because I have concerns that they're going to either impede me, from getting into the area, or that they're going to pull me over. So I don't let them know until I'm actually there. I feel safer that way. I've had instances where, because I've been to I was at the Fairy Creek protests a number of times, and I've had instances where, a big, burly, commanding officer, stood in front of me, yelling at me, intimidating me when I was by myself, and made me go trek through a bush to find my way up. And I ended up, cutting myself and bleeding and being in total tears. And the officer, making degrading comments and things like that. So I have this intensified level of, anxiety when I am working in these situations, but it also is helpful to know my rights and just to have that security set in place where my editors know where I'm at, within a certain time frame.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to extend that question as well to Justin and Chris, if you guys want to jump in about what keeps you motivated and continuing to do this despite the very difficult circumstances. So.
I mean, Indigenous rights and sovereignty are, in my opinion, probably the most important story in Canada. And it's not, it's not a single story, but anything that matters to us as Canadians, all of the privileges that have been afforded to us has come on the backs of the theft of Indigenous peoples' lands and the violence against Indigenous peoples. And we can report from Parliament Hill, we can report on policy and legislative issues about First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, but when it comes to those who are actually going, putting their lives and their safety on the front lines, on the line to defend their lands, which are sacred to them and which carry all of the knowledge of thousands of years into the present. Those stories, I think, Canadian media has been complicit enough in colonization, and that's not really just my opinion. It's detailed in reports and studies and books and everything. And so as Canadian journalists, we owe it to Indigenous peoples to be there when they are fighting to defend themselves against further colonial encroachment and colonial violence. And so that's my motivation personally for covering these stories. But I will add that the more I see the state and police forces working to, and corporate interests working to suppress that coverage, whether it's arresting journalists, using court injunctions to try to close off areas where they don't want people to see what's actually happening, that strengthens my resolve as a journalist. And I personally don't have any plans to kind of quit focusing on these types of stories.
Yeah, if I can just build on that, I think there's two things that keep me motivated throughout the challenges that we face. And the first is the strength of the purpose. Really, I see us as a public service, and we're here to inform and engage the public in ways that they wouldn't be able to without us. And then the second thing would be the strength of the relationships between us as workers and the publications that we work for. I think the stronger, in my experience, the stronger that relationship is, the more supported we are in doing that work, the more respected we are as we're performing that work and the work itself, the more motivated I am to do the very best that I can do in relaying the stories of the day. So it's really those two things: the strength of the purpose and the strength of the relationships between freelancers or workers and their publications.
Thanks. Any more questions? Please. Would you mind going to the microphone though, so that we can capture? Thanks.
What's the one thing that you as journalists wish you'd known sooner before getting into the field? And what's the one advice that you wish that you would pass on to young journalists that are entering the field right about now?
Thank you. Who wants to go first? Justin, Cole, Chris, Brandy?
My one immediate thought would be logistics. Just understand 90% of your work is logistics.
Fair point. Anyone else want to tackle that one?
I think you also need to know what your rights are. I think that gives you a sense of purpose and why you're there, makes you understand what you're doing and that you're not there just as a convenience, but you're there to serve the public. And I think keeping that in mind is really helpful.
Yeah, the purpose element I think is essential.
I think also you're not entitled to anything. You're not entitled to a story. You're not entitled to be anywhere. You need to earn that. You need to earn the trust of the people whose story you're telling, and you're telling it with them. You're not taking their stories. So I think early on that didn't click, but I know that now, or I like to think I know that now. Yeah, you got to earn it.
I would say, just to build on that, I really like that, and that this whole discussion about the move away from extractive journalism is really important right now, especially when we're talking about marginalized peoples or marginalized communities. And it's important to remember too that when we tell someone's story, when we quote somebody on the public record, I mean, whatever we say about them can stay with them forever. And it's one thing if you're holding power to account, but if you're interviewing everyday folks, especially people who have been victims of some type of violence, whether it's systemic or direct violence, remember that what we say, we have to put real serious care into everything that we write or say or the footage that we show. And it's really hard, to be frank, it's really hard to do some of these things and think through some of these things when we're working in daily news, when we're in the daily news cycle. And so I guess one piece of advice I would say is, because I've tried it all. I've been in daily news, and I'm back to being totally independent now and working on my own deadlines for the most part. But really think about whether you feel good at the end of the day once you've told the story. Once you've had time to reflect on stories you've told, is there something still nagging at you? Do you feel good, or do you feel great about it? And if you're constantly not feeling good about the work that you're doing, you may not be in the right place or working with the right people.
If I can just double dip and add one last thing and building on that, I think beyond treating your subjects and subject matter with dignity, you also, to do it effectively, you have to treat yourself with dignity and care, and you really do have to take care of yourself. I think this old school mentality of, the story at all costs, even that means the degradation of yourself. And I think we see that that's an unsustainable working model. So taking care of yourself as well, your mental health and emotional health, your physical health, and treating yourself with dignity as well throughout the story process.
Yeah, exactly, knowing your worth. This is an entirely different discussion, but it's been really heartening to see over the past 5 to 7 years how mental health and the importance of having an understanding of a kind of trauma-informed work has really grown and seems to have become very commonplace in a lot of major newsrooms and independent ones as well. Brandy, did you want to add to that, or Justin, anything else? Cole or Chris? No? Okay. Any other questions?
Can I add something?
Oh, or Steph, yes, please.
Unrelated,
Sorry,
but
yes.
not really. I just wanted to point out that we're, very pleased to be joined disproportionately and greatly by freelance and independent media workers today. And there's been a lot of discussion about the sort of personal onus and responsibility to contend with any number of press freedom violations and their personal impacts, and how much focus on the mission-driven nature of the work kind of compels people forward. Meanwhile, and this doesn't, you know, this isn't an entirely unique moment in this industry's history, but we're also seeing a lot of clawbacks in media labor and the increasing decimation of job security as we're trying to push forward with increasing education and labor standards. And just wanted to note that all of these insights are really important and inform why we get to see so much outstanding work from the people who are here today and so many others. But part of this responsibility, of course, has to come from the institutional level in terms of driving forward the development of education about rights and protecting people from occupational hazards and all the rest.
Can I just quickly, and actually this Friday here at the TMU, the CFU, the Canadian Freelance Union, and UPOC are hosting a freelance solidarity meeting where a number of publications and their workers are meeting to discuss freelance and how to make freelancing better, safer, etc. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Any more questions? If not, I just kind of wanted to wrap up by saying that it would be great if you guys can all scan the QR code to check out CPJ's Know Your Rights Guide, CPJ and Thomson Reuters. Know Your Rights Guide that is on our website. It's available in both English and French, and is a wonderful resource. It's also linked on our homepage if you go to cpj.org. Yeah, and with that, I wanted to say thank you so much to the Thomson Reuters Foundation for all of their work, to the law firm that we worked with as well, Blake's, and Brent and the Canadian Association of Journalists for all of their work on helping organize this panel, to Steph and Wexler and Sonia at TMU for helping put this together, for Justin and Brandy for joining us virtually. Zoom is never fun, but thank you for bearing with us, and Cole and Chris as well for joining us in person. So thank you guys so much. Have a great day.